Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Electra's fritters quivered as they closed around the object hidden beneath the loose floorboard in Dylan's apartment, the thin subcast of dust sheeting the black fabric adhering to her skin like a warning she had ignored for far too long, and in that moment, as the mask came completely into view, satiny and unmistakable, a bite ran through her body because this wasn't just any mask but the veritably one Luna had worn on the night she dissolved, the night everyone mourned her, the night. Dylan appeared out of nowhere with his gentle smile, his precisely drafted stories, and his uncanny capability to always be in the right place at the right time, and suddenly the recollections began to collide in Electra's mind, every odd regard, every moment when Dylan knew too important, every time his voice softened when Luna's name was mentioned, and as Electra's heart pounded louder than her studies, she rumored the verity before she was ready to accept it, because every single thing, had been a taradiddle, and the consummation shattered her such like glass, forcing her to defy the insolvable. Dylan was Luna, Luna was Dylan, and the deception was deeper, darker, and more ruinous than anything she had imagined, and as she stood there in the dim light, the weight of the verity pressed down on her casket, suffocating her with treason, because Luna hadn't just faked her death, she had stolen another identity, lived another life, manipulated everyone who loved her, and worst of all, she had let Electra suffer her, let her cry, let her swear revenge against a world that had taken Luna down, all while Luna watched from behind Dylan's eyes, and as Electra staggered back, clinging the mask like substantiation and like armament, she felt wrathfulness enkindle inside her, sharp and righteous, because Luna had crossed a line that could no way be cancelled, and in that moment Electra knew she couldn't stay silent, she couldn't cover the taradiddle any longer. She couldn't allow Luna to continue this twisted performance, not after everything that had been destroyed in its wake, and so Electra marched straight to the Forrester living room, where the entire web of falsehoods had been spun, where Brooke sat clinging her coffee, Ridge stood with his arms crossed, Steffi paced with dubitation etched into every step, and Hope watched with quiet concern, and when Electra burst in, eyes blazing, voice shaking but strong, she threw the mask onto the table like a lemon and demanded that everyone look at it, really look at it, because this wasn't just a mask, this was the verity they had been avoiding, and as the room fell into stupefied silence, Electra told them everything, how she set up it, where it was hidden, how Dylan's story unraveled the moment the mask came into her hands. And with every word, the shock strengthened, unbelief gurgled through the room, and denial tried desperately to hold its ground, until Dylan himself walked by, smiling as usual, ignorant that his precisely erected vision had formerly begun to deteriorate, and when his eyes fell on the mask, commodity flitted across his face, fear, recognition, fear, and that was all Electra demanded, because she stepped forward and spoke the words that would change everything. Dylan doesn't live. Luna does, and the rustle that followed echoed like thunder, because suddenly the pieces fit together in a way no bone wanted but no bone could deny, and Dylan tried to laugh it off, tried to spin another story, but Electra didn't stop. She listed the dates, the inconsistencies, the moments when Luna's habits slipped through Dylan's facade, the way Dylan touched his choker exactly the way Luna used to, the way his eyes filled with gashes whenever her name was spoken, and as the pressure mounted, the mask lay between them like a silent substantiation, criminating and inarguable, until eventually Dylan's shoulders sagged, the fight drained from his posture, and in a moment that felt suspended in time, he reached up, not to remove the mask but to remove the last subcast of denial, admitting in a broken voice that yes, everything had been a taradiddle, that Luna had been Dylan each on, that fear had driven her to vanish, that despair had pushed her to resuscitate herself, and that nearly along the way, she induced herself she could live both lives without consequences, and the fallout was immediate and explosive. Brooke wept in unbelief, mourning Luna each over again while gaping at her alive before her. Ridge demanded answers with fury burning in his eyes, Steffi called it insupportable, Hope looked shattered by the treason, and Electra stood at the center of it all, shaking but resolute, because exposing Luna wasn't about vengeance, it was about verity, and as Luna collapsed into gashes, confessing the loneliness, the paranoia, the terror that made her hide behind Dylan's face, the room came a battleground of feelings, wrathfulness colliding with pity, love colliding with treason, and yet Electra knew that no matter how woeful Luna's reasons were, they didn't excuse the damage she had done, the trust she had destroyed, the lives she had manipulated. And as security was called, as voices rose and alliances fractured, one thing was clear: the taradiddle was over, the mask was out, and nothing in their world would ever be the same again, because in exposing Luna's disguise as Dylan, Electra hadn't just revealed an identity, she had ripped open injuries that would take times to heal, setting off a chain response of consequences that would hang them all, proving formerly and for all that in the world of B&B, secrets no way stay buried, masks always fall. And the verity, no matter how shocking, always demands to be seen. In the fate of the disclosure, the air in the Forrester living room sounded permanently altered, thick with the residue of unbelief and heartache, and indeed after Luna, no, Dylan, had been attended out under a pall of allegations and unanswered questions, the echo of Electra's words continued to resonate through every corner of the house, through every relationship that had ever been touched by Luna's presence. Because now every memory had to be redefined, every commerce reinterpreted, and every emotion questioned, and Electra herself felt as though she were standing in the center of a storm she had unleashed, watching the people around her struggle to acquaint themselves in a reality that no longer adhered the rules they formerly trusted, and yet indeed as guilt dragged at her heart, she knew she'd do it again, because the verity, formerly seen, couldn't be unseen. And as Brooke sank onto the lounge with pulsing hands, brooding Luna's name like a prayer and a curse intertwined, Electra felt the sharp sting of empathy slice through her wrathfulness, knowing that Brooke's grief was now grotesquely doubled, mourning a son who had failed, only to discover she had been alive and lying all along, while Ridge paced like a boxed beast, his fury not just aimed at Luna but at himself for missing the signs, for trusting Dylan, for allowing deception to take root so near to home. And Steffi's voice cut through the chaos with cold clarity as she declared that this wasn't just emotional treason, it was felonious, identity fraud concentrated atop cerebral manipulation, a calculated performance that risked everyone, and hope, silent until now, eventually spoke in a small, broken voice that carried further weight than any cry, admitting that what hurt the most wasn't the taradiddle itself but the way Luna had let them love her doubly, formerly as herself and formerly as someone differently, and had taken that love without ever intending to give honesty in return, and Electra felt gashes soak her eyes as she realized that exposing the verity hadn't ended the pain, it had multiplied it, raying outward like cracks in ice, touching everyone else but deeply all the same, and when the house eventually voided and night fell, Electra set up herself alone, gaping at the mask now sealed inside an substantiation bag, its lustrous face reflecting her own haunted expression. And she wondered when exactly she had stopped seeing Luna as a victim and started seeing her as a villain, and whether the line between the two had ever truly was at each, because as the hours passed, fractions of Luna's concession replayed in her mind: the fear, the paranoia, the belief that getting Dylan was the only way to survive, and despite everything, Electra couldn't deny that there had been moments when Dylan's kindness felt real, when the grins weren't rehearsed, when the concern wasn't faked. And that consummation unsettled her further than the taradiddle itself, because if Luna had been able of genuine connection while living a false life, also what did that say about the nature of identity, about the masks everyone wore in quieter, more socially respectable ways? And yet indeed as these philosophical dubieties crept by, the consequences of Luna's conduct began to solidify with brutal clarity, because by morning the news had spread, whispers turning into captions, enterprise kindling like campfire, and suddenly Luna wasn't just a woman who had prevaricated to her family, she was a reproach, a symbol of deception in a world formerly addicted to treason, and Electra watched from the sidelines as legal brigades were assembled, statements drafted, and reports braced for impact, knowing that her part as the bone who exposed the verity would ever define her place in this story, whether she wanted it to or not. And when she was called in to give her sanctioned statement, relating formally again how she set up the mask, how the timeline unraveled, how Dylan's actuality collapsed under scrutiny, Electra spoke with steady resoluteness, indeed as her heart fractured again with every retelling, because this was no longer about particular pain, it was about responsibility. And as Luna sat across from her in the interrogation room, no makeup, no mask, no pretense left to hide before, their eyes met in a moment that felt unbearably intimate, Luna's aspect filled with remorse, defiance, and commodity dangerously close to relief, as if being seen at last, indeed in disgrace, was preferable to the exhausting burden of maintaining the taradiddle. And when Luna eventually spoke directly to Electra, thanking her for ending it, for forcing the Verity into the light when Luna herself had been too hysterical to do it. Electra felt a swell of clashing feelings so important it left her breathless, because remission floated on the edge of her knowledge like an interdicted study, and yet she knew that remission didn't mean forgiveness, that empathy didn't abolish damage, and that understanding motive didn't negate responsibility. And as the days turned into weeks, the fallout continued to reshape their world in unanticipated ways, alliances shifting, old injuries continuing, and new fractures forming where trust formerly lived, Brooke oscillating between craving and rage, Ridge burying himself in work to avoid defying his own conspiracy, Steffi pushing relentlessly for consequences as a way to reclaim control, Hope retreating inward, questioning her faith in people altogether, and through it all Electra carried the quiet weight of being the catalyst, the bone who pulled the thread that unraveled everything. And yet as painful as it was, she also tasted a strange, hard-earned clarity arising from the wreckage, because the taradiddle that had poisoned them had been removed, and in its place, still raw and jagged, was reality. And in one final, unanticipated moment of battle, when Luna was transferred and allowed a brief, supervised farewell, she turned to Electra and said that getting Dylan had started as a way to escape fear but ended as a way to understand herself, that living as someone differently had shown her the corridor of herself she had been too hysterical to face as Luna. And Electra heeded, not with remission but with honesty, replying that running from Verity only gives it further power, and that the mask had no way defended Luna, it had only delayed the ineluctable reckoning. And as Luna was led down, the door closing with a futurity that echoed like a punctuation mark on a long, woeful judgment, Electra exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding for months, perhaps times, realizing that while the shock of unmasking Dylan and chancing Luna beneath had changed everything, it had also reaffirmed commodity essential that Verity, no matter how ruinous, was the only foundation strong enough to make a future upon. And as she stepped back into the sun, the world still fractured but no longer false, Electra understood that the story was far from over, that mending would be slow, remission uncertain, and consequences necessary. But the taradiddle was gone, the mask destroyed, and for the first time since Luna's exposure, the path forward, however painful, was eventually real. The days that followed Luna's junking from their lives didn't bring the check everyone had anticipated. Rather, they steered in a strange, liminal period where the Verity was but refused to settle, swimming like dust in sun, visible and necessary. And Electra snappily learned that exposing a taradiddle didn't automatically restore trust, nor did it abolish the emotional imprints left behind by months of deception, because far and wide she went she could feel the foreshocks of the disclosure, in the hushed exchanges that stopped when she entered a room, in the cautious aesthetics from people who weren't sure whether to thank her or condemn her, and in the quiet moments alone when she questioned how important of herself had changed simply by knowing what she now knew. And as the Forrester family tried to recapture some semblance of normality, it came clear that Luna's double life hadn't only shattered connections but had subtly altered the power dynamics between them, because secrets have a way of redistributing authority, and Electra, formerly on the fringe, now set up herself deposited as a reticent moral center, the bone who had seen through the vision and dared to gash it down. And while some respected her courage, others begrudged the chaos it had unleashed, particularly when the legal consequences began to take shape and processes arrived, dragging the reproach out of private grief and into public scrutiny, forcing everyone to answer questions they weren't prepared to face. And as Electra sat through grounds and interviews, retelling the story again and again, she began to notice how the narrative shifted depending on who was hearkening, how some framed Luna as a master manipulator, others as a deeply damaged woman who had lost her way, and still others as a symptom of a larger culture of secretiveness and reinvention that defined their world. And this multifariousness of interpretations unsettled Electra, because it reminded her that Verity, formerly released, doesn't belong to any one person. And yet amid the noise, there were moments of piercing clarity, similar as the autumn. Brooke eventually asked Electra the question she had been avoiding, whether there had been any part of Dylan, of Luna, that felt real, and Electra dithered before answering, choosing honesty over comfort, admitting that yes, there had been genuine kindness, genuine connection, and that maybe that was the most painful part of all, because it meant Luna hadn't been empty or cruel by nature, only alarmed. And Brooke's face crumpled as she absorbed that verity, realizing that the son she Mourned and the person she had been betrayed by weren't separate realities but the same soul fractured by fear, and this consummation didn't vindicate Luna, but it complicated the grief in a way that made it heavier rather than lighter, because mourning someone who chose to vanish is far more complex than mourning someone taken by fate, and as Ridge plotted with his own reckoning, passing to Electra that he felt complicit for not questioning Dylan sooner, for drinking him into their lives without demanding evidence. Electra gently reminded him that deception thrives not only on cleverness but on trust, and that the desire to believe in people is an excrescence, indeed when it's exploited, and still, the guilt dallied, manifesting in restless nights and strained exchanges, while Steffi's response remained firm and exacting, her asseveration on responsibility serving as both a guard and armament, because for her, allowing Luna's conduct to be softened by sympathy felt like an assignation for unborn backstabbings, and though Electra understood Steffi's station, she also tasted the fear beneath it, the fear that if this taradiddle could go unnoticed for so long, also nothing was truly stable, nothing truly safe, and hope, drifting still on the edges of these debates, ultimately commended in Electra that the disclosure had shaken her faith not just in people but in her own judgment, because she had believed in Dylan, had trusted her instincts, and now those instincts felt unreliable, and Electra heeded without offering tropes, knowing that rebuilding trust begins not with consolation but with admitting the depth of the crack, and as the weeks passed, the public seductiveness with the reproach sluggishly began to wane, replaced by the coming sensational caption, but for those directly affected, the consequences remained intimate and ongoing, particularly for Electra, who set up herself scuffling with a subtle but profound shift in her sense of tone, because being the bone who unmasks a taradiddle changes how you're seen and how you see yourself, breeding both confidence and insulation, and late one evening, as she walked alone along the sand, the sound of the swells mirroring the meter of her studies, Electra considered how fluently she might have ignored her reservations, how tempting it would have been to save the vision for the sake of peace, and she realized that the courage she had shown didn't come from certainty but from discomfort, from the incapability to live with unanswered questions, and this consummation strengthened her resoluteness, indeed as it left her lonelier than ahead, and when news arrived that Luna had accepted a plea deal, sparing the family a drawn-out trial but cementing the reality of her conduct in legal terms, the response was mixed, relief intertwining with undetermined wrathfulness, and on the day the agreement was perfected, Electra entered a letter from Luna, precisely written, devoid of defenses, admitting the detriment she had caused and expressing a quiet gratefulness for being forced to stop running, and Electra read it sluggishly, allowing herself to feel sadness without surrendering to it, because while the letter didn't change the history, it did affirm commodity essential that verity, formerly revealed, creates the possibility for responsibility, and as life gradationally preceded its outside routines, fashion shows planned, meetings listed, horselaugh cautiously greeted, the absence of Dylan and the absence of the vision he represented, came strangely liberating, because without the taradiddle, there was room for commodity further honest to crop, indeed if that honesty was uncomfortable, and Electra began to smell that her part in the family was evolving, no longer defined by propinquity to others but by her own moral compass, and when a youngish intern nervously asked her one day how she had known commodity was wrong, Electra answered simply that falsehoods leave echoes, subtle inconsistencies that reverberate if you're willing to hear, and as she spoke, she understood that the heritage of exposing Luna wasn't just the destruction of a deception but the reaffirmation of alert, of curiosity, of the responsibility to question what feels too impeccably constructed, and in a final, quiet moment of reflection, standing before the ocean as the sun dipped below the horizon, Electra accepted that the shock of unmasking Dylan and chancing Luna beneath had permanently altered her world, not by making it darker, but by stripping down the comfort of visions, and while the pain of that loss would loiter, so too would the strength that came from facing reality head-on, because in the end, everything that had been a taradiddle had given way to commodity far more delicate and far more precious, the verity, unmasked, exacting, and alive. As afterlife edged closer, bringing cooler air and shorter days, the emotional temperature within the Forrester route shifted from raw shock to commodity quieter and more complex, a stage where the adrenaline of disclosure faded and left behind the slow, painting work of reckoning, and for Electra this period proved to be the most delicate of all, because without the urgency of exposure or the clarity of outrage, She was left alone with the subtler consequences of her choice, the way people now measured their words around her, the way honesty had come both her character and her burden, and though she no way rued unmasking Luna, she began to understand that verity tellers frequently pay a long-term price, one that doesn't advertise itself loudly but accumulates in small, patient ways, similar as the vacillation before someone confides in you, or the implied supposition that you'll always be the one to notice what others miss. And as Electra proceeded her routines, attending meetings, contributing ideas, moving through familiar spaces that now felt noiselessly altered, she noticed how frequently her studies returned to a single question that no bone differently sounded to ask audibly: who was Luna now that the mask was gone, and more importantly, who were they all without the story they had been living outside? Because the taradiddle hadn't was an insulation, it had shaped opinions, alliances, feelings, and futures, and removing it left gaps that couldn't be neatly filled. And one autumn, as Electra sorted through old design sketches in the office libraries, she stumbled across a brochure labeled in Luna's handwriting, its contents dating back to before her exposure, filled with half-formed ideas, anxious notes, and perimeters crowded with tone mistrustfulness. And as Electra flipped